So what do I?
Okay, so Roy's very kindly put together a presentation on exposure for beginners. Roy,
Yep.
I believe the title is.
Yep.
So over to you. Thanks for doing that. We'll look forward to this.
Right. Wait a minute. Let's just get this. Somewhere here it says enter full screen. There it does. I made the I made my pointer bigger so that hopefully you can all see it.
Yes, excellent.
Yeah.
Good idea.
Anyway, it's well, there you can see the title, Exposure Basics for Beginners. I think the auspicious audience we got here tonight are going to know more about it than me, and probably more than I've written here, but the idea is it's really for beginners. And I have to give thanks to Keith because he sat through an early version and gave me some comments and you know, what I'd left out and perhaps what I put in too much. Anyway, so that's thanks to Keith. So first of all, well, you can see what my name is, you know that already, but a little bit about me. In the late 70s, early 80s, I was chief engineer for this company called AGI, and AGI were an old British camera manufacturer, and here's some examples of their early cameras.
Wow.
Most of these predate me being there, but I just show them because, you know, not many people realize that AGI, well, A, existed, and B, was a British camera company. This one here, the Agilux Colt 44, was also made as the Ilford Sprite in '57, and that was the first camera to have a plastic lens, and it was made by Coil Combined Optics Industries Limited. So that's fairly interesting. But in my time, we were making airborne, you know, aircraft photo reconnaissance cameras, and this thing here called the Agiflight was at that time was like our handheld camera. So you basically held it by this handle here and the front thing, sighted through here. The lenses were Hasselblad lenses that we used to buy, take the casing off them and put our own casing on so they look like ours. But this thing had a weird shutter. Can you see this sort of what I'm circling? That was like a circular plate. And the shutter worked. It was like a cheese wedge that flew around in a circle to give the shutter.
Wow.
But anyway, that's enough about me. Let's get on to what we're supposed to be talking about. First of all, definition of exposure. I've written this. Exposure is the act of using the shutter to allow light to reach the camera image sensor. So it's really, this is, you know, in other words, it's exposure is the act of taking a picture, basically. But you're allowing light to reach the camera sensor. And then if we have another look at a definition for exposure, and here is the thing that we're really going to be talking about tonight. Exposure is the amount of light reaching the image sensor, and it's determined by three things: the shutter speed, the lens aperture, and the sensor sensitivity. Now, these things are a bit sort of hard to grasp, aren't they, for a beginner, like light and lens aperture and all those sort of things. So I've come, first we'll get to that. There's a thing that people often talk about, exposure triangle. The first arm of the triangle we can think of is shutter speed, and speed's a funny word really. It's really time, because it's measured in fractions of a second or minutes. On some cameras it's called TV, which is time value. In another place you might see exposure time written. So that's the first arm of the exposure triangle. The second arm is the lens aperture. This is known as F number. Some people call it F number. Some people call it AV, which is aperture value, or it could be called the iris setting. And then we get to the third arm of the exposure triangle, which is the sensitivity. In the old days, this would be the film, and its speed, in other words, its sensitivity is measured in ISO, ASA, some people say film speed. So basically that's exposure triangle. We've got three things contributing to exposure, and as we shall see in a minute, I've drawn it as an equilateral triangle because each of these three things are equally weighted, I suppose. Okay, so if we now go on and try and explain things a bit more deeply, what I've got here is a picture of I'm making light. I'm replacing it with water. So basically here I've got a big tank of water. I've got a tap, the red thing, and I've got a pipe here. And if I turn the tap on, then the water flows through here and it fills up the bucket. Okay, everybody got that idea? And then on the right-hand side, I've got basically the same idea, except that now I've got a much bigger pipe, so I'm letting a lot more water through, but I'm only letting it through for less of a time. So basically, the size of the pipe is analogous to the aperture, and the shutter speed is the clock turning the tap on and off. So as I put here, a little for a long time can be the same as a lot for a short time. Okay, everybody happy with that? And we've got this bucket here, which we can call the sensor. And for an ideal exposure, this wants to be nicely full. Anything that drips over the top is lost. So we want to avoid that if we can. So that's really talked about two things of the exposure triangle. But we actually talked about a third thing, didn't we, which was sensitivity. So if we look here, if we look here, sensitivity represented this by two different sizes of buckets. So with low sensitivity, it takes a lot more water to fill the bucket than it does with high sensitivity, okay? So if we now think about this bucket here, could be different sizes. I think you can see that it's a combination of how long you have the tap on for, how big the pipe is, and how big the bucket is to give you your exposure. Everybody happy with that?
Yeah.
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 Yeah. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. But I've actually called the sensor a bucket. It's actually a heck of a lot of smaller buckets called pixels, and these are arranged in a rectangular array. So this is looking at the side, but there would be rows and rows and rows of these in a 3:2 arrangement. And just to give you some idea, if it was a 12 megapixel camera, there would be that many pixels. So heck of a lot of pixels. So when we're talking about filling the thing with water, we're actually filling all these little tiny buckets. And as I've put here, for an ideal exposure, each pixel should contain some water, in other words, some light. Any overspill, this bit dribbling down the side, is lost and the picture shows pure white. In other words, you can't see any detail in it. Similarly, any empty ones come up as pure black, so no detail there either. So ideally, we want these little buckets to be somewhere between, 0 and totally full. Okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're now going to look at each of the three arms of the triangle. aperture, or f-stop, denotes the area of the circular hole which lets the light through to the lens, and it sets the image brightness at the sensor. This iris here is a 6-bladed one. These blades, as you alter the aperture, these slide over each other and make the hole bigger or smaller, and the hole in the middle is the aperture. Now, a lot of this in photography goes back to the early days, and you can see I've used the word stop. Basically, in the early days, these things, the aperture was controlled by a ring on the lens, and the ring on the lens was a mechanical thing that you turned to make this open and close, and there were actually physical stops, clicks. So an f-stop was from one click to the next, and basically one stop gave a relative halving or doubling of the area from one click to the next, therefore doubling or halving the exposure. Now, why it was doubling or halving, I think, is lost in the midst of time a bit, really. But with early film and early emulsions, their sensitivity wasn't great. And I think really you had to double the exposure of a film negative in order to see anything to be, you know, worth seeing in the early days. So that's probably where an f-stop came out to be a halving or a doubling. So next thing people ask is, why are they stupid numbers? Oh, here's a lens, look, and you can see the f-stops on here. So these were, if you turn this ring, these will go click, 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 click to give you those. So those are the stops. Anyway, an area of the circle is pi r squared, where r is the radius. So if you increase or reduce the radius by √2, you get a halving or doubling of the area. So, and √2 is 1.414. So that's the magic number that basically sets f-stop. So if you go from f1 to 1.4, that's increasing the radius of the hole in here by 1.4 times, and hence doubles the area. I think I'm going wrong because this is the biggest and this is the smallest. But can you see what I'm saying? That 1.4, all of these go up by 1.4. Yeah. So it goes 1, 1.4, 2 times 1.4 is 2.8. Then you get to 5.6, then you get to 11, and then you get to 22. So that's the reason for those weird numbers. And obviously you can't write 1.414, so 1.4 got rounded down. But those are the numbers that are sort of burnt on all photographers' brains, really. Those are the f-stop numbers. Okay.
Can I just say that because every other one doubles, you only need to remember the first two, 1 and 1.4.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So you can actually work out the next one be 5.6 or 11 or something just by remembering the 1 and 1.4.
Yeah. Yeah. So long as you've got a mental arithmetic, but yeah.
That's me out.
Okay, so now we're talking a bit about more modern cameras. So nowadays the aperture isn't set by click rings anymore, it's set by a magic button, and the camera can alter settings by a third of a stop or even smaller to give very fine control of exposure, and that's all been brought about with modern sensors and modern sensitivity and all those sort of things. Anyway, the maximum f number of a lens is related to its focal length and the diameter of the glass element. So here you can see these are both 135mm lenses. This one's an f2 lens, that's the biggest aperture you can have on this one, and this is an f2.8, so you can see it's correspondingly smaller, and that's part of the reason why these lenses as I put here, maximum aperture is called faster. This is a faster lens than this one because it can let more light through, but it's also a lot more expensive because to make an f2 lens, you know, the glass is much bigger, the body's much bigger, so that's why the price shoots up. If I can go, oh, now this is the weird slide because this goes weird. So this so far is the same as you've seen before, but now we've got this bit added in the bottom. So here you can see as the apertures, as the numbers get bigger, the apertures get smaller, and it's the doubling and halving that we talked about before.
Mm-hmm.
But a thing worth noting, and I think maybe beginners don't realise, is that the actual hole diameter is a function of the focal length of the lens and some other things. It's not the same diameter on every lens, but what it does do, it means that f2.8 on this lens would take the same exposure as f2.8 on that lens. So one thing about this is it makes it that whatever lens you put on your camera, if it needs f2.8, it'll be f2.8 on that lens. Does that make sense?
Mm.
Yeah.
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 Okay.
Yeah, obviously not all lenses could do f2.8 because they're not big enough lenses, are they?
No.
I was going to say it's by design. The f number depends on the focal length of the lens.
Yeah.
And the amount the image spreads out on the sensor depends on the focal length of the lens. So that's why they use f numbers, so that the exposure is equivalent between different focal length lenses.
Yeah. But I mean, we could write all the maths down, Terry, but this is supposed to be for sort of beginners, really. Anyway,
but it's not really maths. It's just why different focal length lenses have different size holes for the same f-stop.
Yeah.
But the f-stop determines the exposure. So.
Anyway, we're now on to shutter speed, which is another leg of the exposure triangle. So here again, from history, shutter speed stops were halving or doubling of speed, or doubling of time, really. So typical shutter speeds were 1 second, a half, a quarter, an eighth, and so on down. Slower speeds, as you can see on this dial here, this has got shutter speeds of 2 seconds and 4 seconds, which is slower. It's also got this thing called B, which is bulb. And basically in bulb, what happens is that you press the shutter once and it opens the shutter and stays open until you press it a second time, whereupon it closes. So if you wanted, 10 seconds exposure, you can just press it and then leave it 10 seconds and press it again. Again, a modern camera will control shutter speeds more closely than this. And modern ones have electronic shutters as well as mechanical ones. And that means you can have shutter speeds 20,000th of a second, or even I've seen them up to about 40,000th of a second, have I, Terry? Perhaps faster than that.
Oh.
I think 32 I've seen, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So things are getting, basically with computers in cameras, things are getting more accurate, and they can change by a smaller degree, and they can, we reap the benefit of photographers. Now this is the third part of the exposure triangle. And this is sort of something that's only happened recently, well, since digital cameras, because originally film was made in various speeds, and once you bought the film, and it might have been ISO 200 or whatever it was, but once you put it in the camera, you couldn't change the speed. It was stuck for that whole film, whatever it was. But today, a camera can alter the sensitivity for each exposure. Okay, so in other words, going back to our buckets, you can change the bucket size from shot to shot, whereas before with film, you could only basically change the bucket size when you put a new film in. Somebody just, oh, I thought I just sent somebody to sleep.
No, I just,
Anyways, sensitivity is measured in ISO units. In the old days, it used to be measured in other units as well, but let's just think of modern things in ISO units, which is linear. So 400 ISO is twice as sensitive or fast as 200 ISO. So we can now think of setting as a stop. So doubling or halving the ISO halves or doubles the exposure. And once again, your modern camera doesn't muck about doing doubles or halves. It can do anything it likes. Okay, happy?
Yeah.
So here we go then. Exposure is a combination of aperture, shutter speed and ISO. Determines the amount of light reaching the sensor, and the three settings are controlled separately but work together to give the exposure. So that's why we talk about the exposure triangle, and I drew it as an equilateral triangle because all three parts of the triangle have equal weight. They work together. So here I've put the same exposure will be given, for example, if you increase the aperture by 1 stop and decrease shutter speed and ISO by half a stop, that comes back to the same thing. Happy with that?
yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So here, this chart, ISO, the sensitivity is constant, but as we go from left to right, all of these combinations are basically the same exposure, or they will give you the same exposure. So a 500th f1.4 would be the same as f32 for 1 second. Now, as Peter pointed out earlier on, you won't be able to get all of these on your lens necessarily, but this is, this is the maths of it. In the old days with lenses, very often the f-stops and the shutter speeds were 2 rings, one on top of the other. So once you set one exposure, say that, then if you click to the right or the left, you would go like that or like that. So it would keep the pairing. Anyway, here we've got aperture and shutter speed, and here we've got, what's happening. Because though these are the same exposure, they may not be the same image. So reducing aperture increases the depth of field, but a slower shutter speed, which results in that, may blur the image. And at the bottom here, if you increase the shutter speed, you can freeze motion, but you're getting a larger aperture, which might give shallower depth of field. So the photographer's got this dilemma, really. You once you've got the so-called exposure, you need to make your mind up what you're going for, whether you're going for freezing the shutter, freezing motion, or you're increasing depth of field. And that leads to having sort of 2 basic modes on a camera, shutter priority and aperture priority. So I've called this a photographer's choice because we just see there's many combinations of shutter speed, f-stop and ISO will give you the same exposure, but your choices affect the Feynman image. So choosing the actual settings you want to use is a compromise. And of course, part of learning is knowing which ones to choose. I think I've said these on the previous slide, but basically to freeze a moving subject, you choose a faster shutter speed and let the other things compensate. Or for a greater depth of field, choose a smaller aperture and let the shutter speed get slower. Personally, I use this one most of the time. I shoot in what's called aperture priority. So I choose the aperture to give me the sort of depth of field that I think I want, and then let the shutter speed and ISO be chosen by the camera to give me an exposure that I want. Or if I'm in low light, you know, at night time, I might choose a greater ISO. In other words, I increase the sensitivity, but a lower shutter speed or greater aperture might come along as a result. Everybody happy with that?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep.
Really good.
So I've put here that obviously there's pitfalls. Camera shake can cause blurry images. Higher ISO brings more noise. I mean, that used to be quite a problem with early digital cameras. In more recent digital cameras, noise isn't such a problem. And you find that modern processing software, you can cope with noise more easily. So it's not such a worry. I mean, on my Fuji, for example, I can shoot at 6,400 ISO and not really worry about it. You do get noise, but it's manageable. And I've already said that before. So obviously, sooner or later, you're going to get pushed up against the end stop, so to speak. You're going to run out of ISO or run out of shutter speeds or apertures. So if you do get pushed to the extremes, then you've got to think of something else to ease things. So using a flash can obviously provide you more light. You can take multiple exposures and use the software to put those exposures together to get the best of both worlds, if you like. That's called high dynamic range. And some cameras will shoot you anything up to a dozen or more multiple exposures, each one slightly different, so that you can put them together and get get a picture with more dynamic range. Or, for example, if you want to take these sort of pictures where you're down by the seaside and you want water to be that nice ethereal look to it, you want a very slow shutter speed because you want to blur the water in effect. So you can use a 10-stop filter to cut the light right down and you know, produce it that way. Then we've got this thing called compensation control, and you can use it to bring out more shadow detail or reduce the highlights in an image. This is one of the beauties I find of a mirrorless camera, because in my old Canon, I used to have to guess the exposure compensation. I'd look at the scene and think, oh, the bit that I'm interested in is a bit darker than the rest, so I'll give it a bit more exposure, or vice versa. So it was guessing how much more to give it. But in a mirrorless camera, when you look through the viewfinder, you see what you're actually going to get. So basically what I do now is I look through the viewfinder and I tweak this compensation dial, and I can see the image getting brighter and darker, and I can choose and I can say, well, that dark bit that I wanted lighter, I can now see what I need to see. So I'll take a picture at that setting. So this particular dial has got up to plus or minus 3 stops on it in a third of a stop changes. So you can make quite a lot of change there. I mean, for example, when I take nighttime shots, very often in a nighttime shot, you'll have, say, a bright red light or whatever, and you'll find that with a normal exposure, that will just come out looking white through the viewfinder. But if you reduce it by maybe even 3, maybe even 4 stops, you get the lovely red color coming through. I mean, obviously it makes everything else a bit more dark, a bit darker, but then in a nighttime shot, maybe what you want is a picture of the lights, and you're not too worried about the rest of the scene. Or fireworks, for example, might be similar. Anyway, that's a very useful control. I mean, I know that Keith, when he bought his, he's recently bought a new camera, he's recently bought mirrorless, and I think this is one of the things that he found as the biggest boon, if you like, for a mirrorless camera, that you could see what you're going to get before you actually press the button. So a little bit about metering. As I put there, the modern metering systems usually get it right, but you do have this choice of whereabouts you're going to meter. The classic one is spot metering, and all the camera is measuring really is a little dot in the middle, and it's usually, when you look through the viewfinder, that's highlighted. So what you do, the idea is that you point the camera at the thing you're interested in, say it's a bird or whatever, you put the spot over the bird, you push the shutter down halfway, and the camera basically measures that value, and then you can move the camera, still holding the shutter halfway down, you can move the camera and recompose the shot. So you might want the bird over in the corner or whatever. And then you push the shutter down all the way, and bingo, you get the shot exposed for the spot that you're interested in. Another one is this thing called center weighted, where the camera assumes that the thing you're most interested in is in the middle, and you're not so interested in the stuff around the outside, and it gives you an exposure weighted towards the center. So that's called center weighted average. This one on this particular graph is same sort of idea, but it's obviously not got the spot in the middle. It's not so weighted in the middle. And this particular mode, the camera is sort of more interested in the darker areas. So they're all sort of schemes designed to sort of do the best they can, assuming they know where you're going to, you know, what parts of the picture you're interested in. Okay, well, let's just have a look at some camera modes. I'm sure everybody's got a button on their camera like this. So in manual, basically you're setting everything. And it's like an old-fashioned camera where you had a separate exposure meter, or you used your eye and you just basically set the settings to suit what you wanted. Aperture priority, this thing called AV, you choose the aperture you want the camera to use. So it's like saying to it, whatever you do, take the picture using f8, and then the camera adjusts the shutter speed and ISO to give the exposure, the correct exposure. So that's AV. The next one is TV, which is shutter speed priority, time value. So here again, you're saying, I'm out at the races or whatever, I'm taking pictures of horses jumping over a fence. I want to have a shutter speed of, I don't know, 500th of a second. So I'm telling you, I want a 500th of a second, and the camera chooses the other settings to make it come right. And then all cameras have this green square or whatever. In full auto, you're saying to the camera, okay, I mean, this is what beginners usually do. They buy a fancy camera, they set it on green square and leave it there forever, because that's the cop-out one, because the camera is now choosing everything. And 9 times out of 10, it does a good job, but not every time. because, you know, it's looking for the average. So on sort of less than top range cameras, sort of hobby cameras, if you like, you tend to get these other modes, and basically they're aimed at, the idea is that if you're taking flowers, you'd set it on this, and this is giving you an exposure that assumes the range that they think you know, a picture of flowers is going to be. You know, somebody running obviously will give you a high speed shutter speed, a portrait, you know, what's this other one? This is landscape. And then most cameras have on their dials C1, C2 and C3. Well, these Canons do. Basically these are settings where you can set a formula. So for example, if you were taking wedding pictures quite often, you could choose to have C1 to be the setting that you like for weddings. You know, it might be that you don't want to burn the dress out, so you underexpose a bit, and you choose a certain shutter speed and aperture to get a decent depth of field. So you can basically set these to easily give you what you want. I mean, I had one set for, like I say, sort of wedding type stuff, and then C2 on mine was for taking pictures of trains. You probably know that I like taking pictures of steam locomotives, so I had one set up so that I'd only switch it to that, and then it was sort of set for the sort of shutter speed and that I wanted to use. So they can be useful. So this goes right back to the first or second slide. Most scenes will have light and dark areas. We don't really want to overload any pixels. We don't want to burn any areas out because we don't see any detail there. Similarly, we don't want too many pixels that are pure black because you get a blocked up, no detail in there. How to avoid this? Well, some cameras have what they call blinkies, show flashing areas in the viewfinder where they're burnt out or blocked up areas. And on my particular camera, I can have these blinkies blinking white or blinking red, I think. They're quite useful if you can get on with them. I don't personally use them because it's a bit distracting to have this sort of flashing away in the viewfinder. But I know some people love them, so they're there and they're an aid to stop you burning out or underexposing areas. Metering can be wrong because it assumes an overall grey tone. So snow scenes, if you just take a basic snow scene, they tend to appear grey rather than white. And that's because the exposure meter is saying to itself, well, this scene is grey really. So it's exposing it for grey, not for white. So here you would have to increase the exposure a bit to get your white looking snow. Anyway, there's this thing called the histogram. We've probably all heard of that. And it's a chart which shows degree of light and dark areas in an image. So this is a little bit about the histogram. So up the top here, well, that's a statement of what a histogram is. Here's a histogram. And on the left-hand side, it's black, what the darkest tones in an image, and on the right, it's the lightest tones. And basically this sort of like mountain shape is showing us for this particular image, there's quite a lot of, this is the amount, if you like, of light, and this is the color, or sorry, the intensity. So it's showing that there's a little bit of total black here, but we haven't burnt out the white, and we haven't really, overdone things too badly. Underneath, this is the grayscale. This is what this is being measured against. So you can see that the grayscale is ranging from total black to pure white. And you've often heard it said that we expose to the right. And that's because if you look at this, if you look from about here to about here, you can see a lot more changes in the grey than you can either here, because here it just looks, more or less total white. And down here it looks total black. So people say you tend to expose to the right hand side, which is what this histogram is showing, to give you an ideal exposure, because you've got more latitude to play with these tones because they are separated. Some cameras, you can see the histogram before the shot's taken. I mean, on my Fuji you can. On my old Canon you couldn't. You could only see it after you'd taken the picture, which is a bit of a disadvantage because it meant you had to take a picture, have a look at your histogram, and if you weren't happy with it, take another one after you'd made some changes. But like I say, with modern ones, you tend to see it before you take the picture. So here's 3 views of different images underexposed. All the pixels are pushed towards the left-hand side. In other words, it's dark, and you can see the image is dark. Here is one that we'll say is correctly exposed, and it's towards the right, the most of it, and it's, a normal scene. And here we've overexposed because we pushed all the pixels to the right-hand side. So that's the histogram is quite a useful thing to get the hang of. I know a lot of photographers always look at their histogram. I have to admit that I don't. That probably makes me a worse photographer than some. Anyway, we've talked about pixels, these little buckets. They're actually masked to see different colors. So they all measure degrees of brightness, but a red one measures degree of red, and so on. And there's twice as many green as there are other colors, because our eyes are basically twice as, we see more green than, we're more sensitive in green. So that's why a camera array is made with more green. So when the processor in the camera looks at this, all it's seeing is how much red is in there, how much green is in there, etc. And what it has to do is it has to make a smooth scene, the image, from all these little bitty chunks of data. And here we go, a JPEG image uses 8 bits per channel of sampling, which was that, do you remember on the last slide we showed the grayscale? That was an 8-bit grayscale. So the 256, for each time it measures these, it can measure the blue or the intensity of that and get a number of anywhere from 0 to 255. So if you do the math, as they say, and you multiply, you cube 256, you get something like almost 17 million colors. And that's more than we can see. So that's why JPEG really is what's used for describing images, because you don't any less than 8 bits, and you wouldn't have this many colors, so it wouldn't cover what we see. Anything more than 8 bits wasn't considered necessary in the early days, because that nicely covered what we saw. But in actual fact, most modern cameras anyway have got 12-bit or more what they call raw data. And so they're capable of producing images far superior to JPEGs. And as I put here, a 12-bit RAW file is about 2,300 times larger than a JPEG. So a RAW file contains one heck of a lot more data than a JPEG. Unfortunately, well, I say unfortunately, but they have to be processed in a computer using a RAW converter. But because they've got so much data, you can extract from them all sorts of stuff that you can't get from a JPEG. And here gives some idea of what you can get with RAW files. So, you know, I won't read those out, you can read them. But the message is basically, you're far better off taking pictures in RAW and processing them afterwards, because you'll get far better detail, far better color range, all these sort of things. So we've sort of come to the end now, really. So
Wake up.
Very good.
Wake up.
Wake up.
well, that's it, really.
Lovely. Thank you.
Excellent.
Right.
Well done. It's about
Very good.
40 minutes.
Yes. Yeah.
Very good.
Anybody got any questions?
You did mention white balances. That's quite important sometimes, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I didn't mention white balance. I was sort of kept away from that, really, because
I know.
Beginners. It's something that I suppose with auto white balance, you know, it's something that I assume that, well, I personally leave mine on auto all the time, unless of course I'm in the studio and the lights have got a particular color, in which case you can dial that in. But I tend to leave it in auto white balance, and you know, I might warm it up a bit, but I'm processing it. But
I see.
Sorry,
go on, Pete. Yeah.
I was going to say, because one good thing about RAW is you can change the white balance after you've taken it as well. So you've got,
sure.
so you've got a lot more latitude.
Sure.
I was going to say the white balance has. I was going to say that the white balance has no effect on the RAW.
No, it's true.
On the
Yeah,
RAW
you're right
files.
there.
Yeah.
But yeah, because sometimes when if you're going to shoot a JPEG, it can be quite critical. I know you leave on auto most of the time, but sometimes the colours just don't come out right, and you need to adjust it slightly.
Yeah. Although, as I say, I you know, I would very rarely touch the white balance on my camera.
No, because you shoot in RAW most of the time. Is that right?
Well, I shoot in both, actually.
Oh, right. Okay, fair enough. Yeah.
But you know, obviously, well, the shots that I suppose I think are my better shots, I use the RAW file. But for sort of everyday stuff, JPEG I think is fine, really.
Okay.
I mean,
We should be asking Karen and Pat probably. Are they our most beginners? Did you get it all? Are you happy?
Yeah, we're your beginners.
did I boggle you, Karen?
Sorry?
Did I boggle you?
No, that was fine.
No, I thought it was really powerful. I thought it was really clear.
Yeah.
Thank you. I've made loads of notes, and I haven't got my battery in my camera at the moment, but as you were going through it, I was trying to go through, and I was thinking about white balance. So I'm really glad that you asked about it, and it's made it a little bit more clear for me. Even the buttons on the top of it, to go over those again, I found exceptionally useful, and I like the exposure triangle. It's really helped me.
Okay.
Thank you.
I've read about it, but that's helped to try and implant it in here for a bit.
See my head swelling.
I think the exposure triangle. So I think exposure triangles are a terrible idea.
Yeah.
Exposure, ISO doesn't really come in. If you strictly speaking, if you're talking about exposure, it's the amount of light, and ISO doesn't come into it. They should be calling it. If you're going to include ISO, you should be calling it a brightness triangle, because it controls the brightness of the image that we produce.
Yeah.
But it's three things that interact, but why it's a triangle never ever made any sense to me.
Well, I suppose because you can pull one leg and reduce the other.
Yeah, but I'd been through that, but the only way that makes sense is if you say the area of the triangle represents the brightness, and you're careful to say the length of each side is the one that makes the brightness bigger. Yeah. So if you increase the size of the aperture, it makes that side bigger, which makes the area bigger. Or if you increase the shutter time, it makes it brighter, so that makes that one bigger. Or if you increase the ISO, you make that one bigger. So it's like there's lots of different shapes of triangles that would have the same area inside, but it's a combination of the three things. But it's brightness, not exposure, really. That's.
What did you think about the buckets of water, though?
Oh, I've got my own buckets. Sorry.
I think things like the buckets make it easier to understand.
I've actually got a presentation to do with sensors and stuff that I've been writing. Nobody's seen it, or anybody else has seen it, but the buckets of water is quite a good analogy for how the sensors work.
Yeah, well, I mean, the other way is sort of electrical circuit, isn't it, with voltage and resistor and current, but not many people understand electrics. So.
No, the buckets of water are fine, but in reality, the buckets are all the same size, and when you change the ISO, you use a different ruler to measure how deep the water is.
Yeah, can do that way. Yeah.
Well, if you use the buckets, if you've got a problem, you only get wet. But if you use electricity, it hurts. You get it wrong.
Well, and if you mix the two, it can be fatal.
Roy, a very, very good talk. I enjoyed it. Thank you. And I think it was very clear. The one thing I might add about RAW is that it gets you off the hook, because there's so much latitude in RAW that if you get the exposure completely wrong, as long as you're not too many stops out, you can recover it. That's quite important to know.
Yeah. I saw once this chap, he was in a bird hide, and he got his camera sort of semi set up for birds miles away, and a fox ran across, right underneath him, and he just went click, and the image out of the camera was terrible. But like you say, using RAW, he brought it right back.
And the other thing I would add about exposure compensation is it's easy not to understand how wrong a camera can be in its exposure. So you assume it's always right, and most of the time it is. But if you take a picture of a black piece of paper and that completely fills the screen, it will come out grey. And if you repeat and you take a white piece of paper and photograph it, it'll also come out grey. So if you want a little black cat against the snow, you're not going to get it right.
No.
So that's why exposure compensation dial is useful. It's for those odd shots where the meter is fooled.
I agree. Exposure compensation is for correcting mistakes in the metering. Although it depends on the camera how clever it is. Modern, especially mirrorless cameras that can look at the whole image, get to be quite clever about the light and dark bits and pick something that tries to fit them both in. And the other thing is, it's a personal choice. If you're more interested in the dark bits or the bright bits, so you use exposure compensation to bring that out.
Absolutely. So we think there's one correct exposure. It doesn't have to be. You might want a dark, moody picture. You might want a high key picture. You might want one bit of a picture to be right and the other bits all in shadow. And so having that ability to control it yourself when you take the picture is really quite useful.
So as beginners,
Mhm.
Do we shoot in JPEG or RAW?
Raw.
In
RAW?
Both.
Raw.
Both.
Well,
Basically,
Both.
shoot in.
If your camera will do it, shoot both, and then you can use the JPEGs if you think they're all right. But the most important thing is the RAW. If you've taken a really good photo, maybe you didn't get it quite right, or even if you did get it right, the RAW's got more information. And if you've got the right software on a computer later, you can process it and choose how to turn the RAW into a JPEG. Whereas the camera,
We need to learn
some
how to do that.
Yeah, it's more.
you would, but the thing is, you might be able to do it in a couple of years. I mean, I've got photos that I took 4 years ago, and to be honest, the software's got better in the last 4 years, a lot better. So I could actually produce a better image from the RAW file that I took 4 years ago today than I could back then. So it was worth having them and saving them.
Yeah, if we take a JPEG and it comes out really well, you don't have to spend so much time on the computer trying to get it right. There is that, isn't there?
There is that.
That's me.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's the easy way out.
if your camera can take both and you're not trying to do bursts because it uses more memory and slows things down, but so if you're trying to do fast bursts, then taking the RAWs will slow you down. But otherwise, there's no real downside to having RAWs as well, and you can keep them kicking around.
So your camera then does both at the same time?
Yeah,
it will store both.
Most cameras do.
Yeah,
I've got RAW on mine because
if you can take a camera, if you can take it in RAW, you'll be able to take it RAW and JPEG at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah, because accidentally Craig put it onto RAW when we were on holiday.
Yeah, you should have a setting to do RAW and JPEG. So
and then
you'll end up with two photos, copies of every photo. I just changed
it back to JPEG somehow.
Yeah, I mean, in simple terms, a JPEG is the processed image of how you set the camera, and the RAW image is expanding of those settings. So that, like you say, if it's too dark, you can lighten it up. But if a JPEG's too dark, you can lighten it up, but it then can create problems where you might get noise and other problems. So
could somebody, when we next get in the hall, please show me then what to do to see if I've got RAW on my camera? Because I don't think I've come across it on mine.
Yeah. What have you got? The
400.
The what one?
400.
400. Yeah, well, it'll have RAW on there.
Should do. We'll
show you. Well, we'll be in the hall next Tuesday. Are you here next Tuesday?
I believe so. Yeah.
Yeah. Bring it along.
If I'm not, what I'll do, I'll try and YouTube it later.
Yeah. It'll be a setting on the menu. I'm almost certain it does RAW and JPEG.
I always take both, but I don't process both. So I process. I go to the trouble of processing RAW when I think the picture's good.
Yeah.
And when it's only so, I either throw it away or I just keep the JPEG.
Yeah.
So, but to have the RAW as a backup, particularly if you've got a great picture or a picture that's gone wrong, but you wish you could make more of it, it is worth it if you can.
So our pictures then are going to be 10 times better than they already are. If we shoot
you'll be winning the competitions and keep it down the bottom.
Yeah, they will be.
You lot rubbish if you're all in RAW. We're just in JPEG.
Yeah. the thing is, you've got such a low starting point. It's got to get better, hasn't it?
Well, that's what we hope.
There's actually another consideration which on my Panasonic and probably other cameras, when you shoot only RAW, the image when you preview the image you've taken in the viewfinder, it's actually a low resolution JPEG that's embedded in the RAW file, so you don't actually see all the details of the photo you took, unless you take JPEG as well, and then it will show the JPEG in the viewfinder when you review the images. So I shoot JPEG and RAW and never use the JPEGs except when I've just taken the photo and can see it in the viewfinder.
Yeah. It varies, doesn't it, from camera to camera? The other thing.
Yeah, I think some Nikons and Canons have sort of high resolution JPEGs embedded in the RAW file, but Panasonic, they're quite low. I think they're only 1920 by 1080 by default, so they're quite small.
Well, another point about that is what you see as the picture you've taken on the back of your camera is a JPEG that the camera has made, but the raw file may actually be better than what you're seeing. So if it seems you've got the exposure completely wrong, you've blown out the highlights and so on, it's just possible that if you had the original raw file, it was better than that.
I hope you all had a laugh last week at my man in the raw overexposed.
It was
He was definitely
overexposed.
overexposed.
We did.
Yeah.
We're trying to work out what he was.
I'm glad I put it in last week.
We were trying to work out what he was up to. I've got the feeling he wasn't just lying there reading his book.
No.
Sure.
Overexposure.
Wow, definitely.
That's what it was called, wasn't it, Patty?
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
because we'd been to see the exhibition and there was one there with a lot of 4 buttons, I think, in a row.
Yeah.
And when I got back, I just thought for a laugh I was going to put it in. The photograph itself was rubbish. I knew that, but I thought it'd give everybody a giggle.
Okay. Anything else anybody wants to ask?
Not at the moment.
No, thanks again, Roy. That was really good.
Yeah, thank you.
Very clear.
Excellent.
Was.
Well done.
And of course, I've recorded it, so it'll be up on YouTube probably tomorrow. I'll let everybody know when it's up. So you can refer back to it and listen to it again. And if there's bits you didn't understand, you can rewatch.
Yeah.
So that's the good thing about recording these videos. And obviously,
that's-
there's lots of
that's
other
why-
ones up there.
Yeah, that's why I wrote quite a lot on the slides, because I thought it's easier to read it than listen, isn't it, really?
Yeah. Yeah. And like you say, you can go back and refer to it and helps you.
Yeah,
Really
that's a
helps.
lot of work as well to do. So
Yeah, it was well done and well put together. And thanks for all the effort, Roy. Much
Yeah,
appreciated.
some of the animation was a bit pants, but
That's all right. It's
Come over
fine.
right.
Very good.
yeah.
Okay, back next week we'll be in the hall. I'm not too sure what the program's going to be, but it'll be something to do with it'll be a case of bringing your cameras along, but I'm not
In
too
the
sure.
raw.
Sorry,
in the raw.
in the raw, yeah.
Might be a bit cold.
Yeah, it's going to be a bit warmer next week.
Oh, good.
Got to warm up sooner or later. Yeah, the weather looks okay next week, so that's good. So yeah, 7 o'clock in the hall. I'll let you know what we're doing by the weekend. I've just got to
One
check a
thing
few
that I
things
was
out.
going to ask is
Yeah.
that I understand that today's the last day if you want to buy Affinity.
Version 2, is it?
Yeah,
Yeah,
Version 2.
it's the last day at the cheap price, isn't it?
40% off.
Yeah.
yeah, believe so.
I mean, I haven't bought it. I don't know what people's views are. I think you think it's worth it.
I
Keith.
got it. Yeah.
I've had it 6 months. I haven't looked at it yet.
Oh, we've got the basic one.
Well, you got version 1. You've
Yeah.
looked at version 2, Keith. There was a few bugs
Yeah,
with it, wasn't there, to
yeah,
start with?
well, it hasn't suited my Windows 10 computer very well, but I think it's okay on a Mac, and
Oh,
it might
right.
be on a Windows 11 computer. One of the problems is launching files from an external library like Lightroom or something like that. It's downloaded in a package that's behind a firewall, so it's not very easy to point Lightroom or similar library to Affinity so that the file launches automatically from it.
Right.
And that's a bug they promised to sort out. It doesn't apply to Mac users because it's a Windows thing. They've given me a sort of patch file that works. So, but it's a temporary fix. It's an ugly temporary fix that solves the problem.
Sorry, go ahead, Keith. Sorry.
Yeah, the program itself is not so radically different that if you've got the first one, I wouldn't rush to buy the second one. It's got 1 or 2 extra new features, but they're quite advanced ones. And if you haven't learned the basic stuff in Affinity, I'm not sure it's entirely worth it.
Right. That's
Mm.
it. Yeah. Yeah, I got version
Yeah,
1.
I was-
I'm happy with that when I use it.
I was going to say the problems are because Microsoft thinks your computer's a phone.
Yes,
Think the computers are what?
I think he
A
does.
phone.
Thinks I'm doing
Oh, right, yeah.
The Affinity version 2 is like an app store app or
right,
something,
okay.
and
Yeah.
apps are not like old school Windows programs. So there isn't sort of an obvious place where an executable is that you can point another program at. But there's a
version-
workaround. I thought,
Version 1 was extremely powerful, and version 2 is only slightly more in ways that are a bit more specialized. So, if you've got version 1, you don't have to rush out.
Fine.
My advice would be learn what you've got.
Yeah.
He's saying that for me.
We've got to switch it on, yeah.
Well, I think we all fall into that trap. You get new software or something, and you don't always use it. So
I
it's a
haven't
fair
noticed
point, isn't it?
yet. Mm.
As Patty's just said, she's had hers a while and not got into it yet. So must get on with it.
Do the new people know that I made a video on Affinity that's available? So you can, it's been recorded, it's on the Camera Club,
It's on the YouTube, yeah.
on the YouTube channel that we've
Yeah,
got.
yeah.
When I open it, I will be using it.
Your videos do get quite a few views, Keith. I was looking the other day to see, and I've reviewed some of them. I've viewed them again to use Affinity. But it's good to go back to. It's there. Good.
Yep.
Okay. Right. Stop the recording.